Imagine a society where the rules of the game just aren't the same for everyone, where your birth basically dictates your whole life.
Yeah, that kind of world.
That's where we're diving in today. France, late 18th century, right on the edge of this massive, massive change. We're talking about the French Revolution.
A period of huge upheaval, social, political, earthquakes, really, and the aftershocks. We still feel them today. It's an amazing story, but complicated.
Totally. And to help us kind of get our heads around it, we're digging into Peter McPhee's Liberty or Death, the French Revolution. We've got some key excerpts here.
Yeah, think of this as our guide through it all.
Our mission, really, for you listening, is to get past just the dates and, the famous names.
Right. We want to understand why. Why did this kingdom, which seemed pretty stable, just implode in 1789?
Yeah, and why was building something new so incredibly difficult, so violent?
Exactly. And was it this fundamental turning point? Or, was it more like a destructive period of just chaos? We're trying to cut through to the core insights, the really important stuff.
Okay, let's do it. So setting the scene. France, just before 1789. What did it actually look like on the ground? What were the basic structures?
Well, the defining thing really was this system of privilege.
Yeah.
Just deeply, deeply entrenched.
Privilege, meaning?
Meaning it wasn't uniform at all. The rules, the burdens, taxes, laws, they varied hugely from one province to another. Like, imagine different states having totally different tax codes today, but way more extreme.
Okay, so a real patchwork.
Yeah, a patchwork. And that alone created, instability.
Right, so definitely not a level playing field. And this affected the economy too, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. You had some areas, sure, focused on big agriculture, feeding the cities. McPhee mentions many courts supplying Paris with grain. But most rural places, they had really mixed economies. People farmed, yeah, but they were also doing crafts, working for wages. It wasn't just purely agricultural.
Interesting. More complex than just the classic image of lords and peasants.
Definitely. And understanding that mix helps explain the different pressures people were under.
Okay. And what about the church? How did religion fit into this picture?
Well, the clergy were a big deal, about 140,000 of them. But again, it wasn't the same everywhere. Catholicism was much, much stronger in places like the West, Brittany especially.
And weren't there Protestants too?
Yep, about 700,000. And they faced all sorts of restrictions, legal, social, So another layer of potential tension there, those religious differences.
Got it. So lots of simmering discontent already. What about the nobility? Were they just one powerful group?
Not at all. Big division. You had the super wealthy nobles hanging out in Paris, living these incredibly lavish lives.
Right.
And then you had the hobereaux. Yeah, the poorer sort of provincial nobles, often really struggling financially, actually. And they tended to resent the fancy Parisian lot. So even within that privileged first estate, you had these internal class divisions.
Fascinating. Divisions within the elite. And how did all this fragmentation, these internal divisions, affect the economy?
It just made things really inefficient. Think about it. No common weights and measures across the whole country, made trade a nightmare.
Right.
Then you had internal customs barriers, taxes just to move goods from one part of France to another.
Seriously?
Oh, yeah. Plus tolls charged by nobles, by towns. McPhee points out it could be easier for some eastern provinces to trade with, like Prussia, than with Paris.
Wow. That's crazy. No wonder it was hard to feel like one unified nation.
Exactly. It was a major drag on any kind of national cohesion or economic progress.
Now, the king, traditionally, wasn't there an expectation that he'd make sure people had, like, basic stuff, affordable bread?
Yes, absolutely. That was a really long-standing idea. The monarch's duty was to ensure the bread supply, keep prices reasonable.
But that was changing.
Well, McPhee talks about this emerging Republican spirit, especially among young guys in some regions. Not Republican like a formal government yet, but...
More like an attitude.
Yeah, an attitude, a willingness to challenge the old authorities, demand a say, questioning things.
And there's that quote from a bishop, right, complaining about how people weren't showing deference anymore, about this unchecked liberty.
Right. And you could say, okay, maybe that's just an old guard guy complaining.
Maybe.
But it also reflects a real shift, that traditional hierarchy where you just accepted your place and deferred to your betters, that was starting to fray.
Yeah, it sounds like the old certainties were really starting to crumble.
Which raises that big question. Was this shift in mindset, this cracking of the old order, making the revolution almost inevitable?
Okay, so we've got this Fractured society, economic problems, decaying authority. What about ideas? Was everyone just accepting this situation?
No way. The decades before 89 were just buzzing with new ideas. This concept of a republic of letters really took hold.
Republic of Letters.
Yeah, not a political thing, but like an imagined community of thinkers, writers, people valuing reason, questioning authority. They thought political power shouldn't just be inherited. It should be based on, public discussion, individual rights.
The power of ideas gaining ground. But how did these ideas actually spread beyond, like, the intellectual elite?
Well, written communication exploded. The number of newspapers, periodicals jumped hugely. Went from maybe 15 in the 1740s to over 80 by the 1780s.
That's a big jump.
It is. But, and this is important, access was still pretty limited. Papers like the Gazette de l'Aide were influential, sure, but expensive.
Yeah.
Most ordinary people couldn't afford them. So ideas were circulating more, but it wasn't like mass media yet.
Bro, not exactly Twitter, but this public sphere, this space for discussion, it wasn't just books and papers, was it?
No, it broadened out. It wasn't just the fancy royal academies anymore. You had new places like Masonic lodges.
The mace.
Yeah, they became important spaces where middle-class men, bourgeois men, could meet and discuss Enlightenment ideas pretty freely, away from the traditional structures.
So new spaces for debate. And how did these maybe more abstract ideas connect with regular people?
Well, you started seeing this contrast drawn in popular culture. The virtuous farmer, honest, hardworking, versus the corrupt aristocrat just living off everyone else.
That sounds like something people could grab onto.
Exactly. It resonated. And writers like Abbé Sieyès really pushed this. His pamphlet, Essai sur les privilèges, huge impact, basically saying the nobility was corrupt and useless, and the third estate, everyone else, was what really mattered.
So it wasn't just dusty philosophy. These critiques were hitting home.
And they weren't always polite critiques either.
I bet not.
You had popular songs sold on the street, really catchy tunes, but with subversive lyrics, and tons of crude, sort of ribald publications mocking the church, the nobles, even the king and queen, using humor and satire to chip away at their authority.
Laughter as a weapon. Interesting. We can't forget the wider economic picture here. France had colonies, right? How did they fit in?
Oh, hugely important. Colonial trade, especially from Saint-Domingue, that's modern Haiti, was a massive source of wealth. Sugar, coffee.
The jewel of the colonies, they called it.
Exactly. But that wealth was built entirely on the brutal system of slavery. Ports like Nantes and Bordeaux got rich off this trade. So you have this glaring contradiction, Enlightenment ideals of liberty spreading, alongside this horrific exploitation.
Yeah, a really stark contrast. And France's involvement in the American Revolution, that must have had a big effect.
Double-edged sword, really. On one hand, seeing the Americans successfully revolt against a king, huge inspiration, proof that these Enlightenment ideas could actually work.
Right.
But on the other hand, helping the Americans cost France an absolute fortune. It basically bankrupted the monarchy.
Oh, wow.
So the very thing that inspired revolutionary ideas also made the economic crisis much, much worse, which of course helped trigger their own revolution.
Intellectual sparks and financial disaster. What a mix. Okay, so things are really heating up now in the years just before 89. What were the key moments pushing things towards the edge?
Well, a few things really piled up. You had the diamond necklace affair back in 85.
Yes, the scandal.
Right. Seemed like just court gossip, but it seriously damaged the Queen's reputation and, by extension, the monarchy's. Made them look totally decadent and out of touch.
Okay.
Then the financial crisis just got deeper and deeper. France was so broke it couldn't even intervene effectively in the Netherlands in 87. Showed how weak they'd become internationally.
A monarchy losing its grip, it sounds like. And attempts to fix things internally just hit a wall.
Pretty much. The Crown tried pushing fiscal reforms, new taxes, but they ran straight into opposition from the parliaments.
The high courts, not like a parliament today.
Exactly. Powerful judicial bodies. And they started using the language of natural rights to block the king's reforms, which ironically gave that kind of language even more legitimacy.
So even the establishment was using revolutionary talk against the king.
It is. And what's really fascinating is how the nobles used it, too. The king called this assembly of notables top nobles, clergy hoping they'd approve a land tax.
Did they?
Nope. They resisted it. But they didn't just say, we don't want to pay. They argued the court needed to be less extravagant first, cloaking their self-interest in this language of reform.
Clever. But that resistance kind of backfired on them, didn't it? It opened the door for bigger demands.
It absolutely did. Because when those reforms failed, the calls grew louder for the Estates General, this old National Assembly that hadn't met for, 175 years?
Wow.
And crucially, people started demanding double representation for the Third Estate, like at that meeting in Vasil, a direct challenge to how things had always been done.
A major power shift being demanded. And once the Estates General was actually called, things really took off.
Oh, yeah. Press censorship got loosened, and boom, an explosion of political pamphlets. Thousands published in just a few months in late 88, early 89, everyone arguing about France's future.
And a key argument was how they'd actually vote in the Estates General.
Exactly. Would it be by order, where the clergy and nobles each got one vote, basically guaranteeing they could outvote the Third Estate? Or by head, where every representative got a vote? That would give the Third Estate, with its larger numbers, a real chance. Louis XVI couldn't make up his mind.
And even the royal family was divided on this.
Oh, yeah. Louis's brothers, the really conservative princes of the blood, were dead set against voting by head. Saw it as undermining everything.
But not all nobles felt that way.
No, some were more liberal, recognized things had to change, and were actually willing to give up some financial privileges. So even the top layer of society wasn't united.
Cracks appearing everywhere. And this is when the cahiers de doléances were drawn up, the lists of grievances.
That's right, drawn up all over France at the local level, getting ready for the Estates General. And what's so interesting is seeing how everyone, nobles, clergy, commoners, use this new language of rights to frame their own specific complaints and demands.
Can you give an example? What sort of things were in them?
Sure. McPhee mentions the Coihiers from Segui. They demanded tax equality, fair shares for everyone, and an end to seigneurial duties. Those old feudal obligations peasants owed lords.
Okay. Practical demands.
Yes, but alongside that, you also see these expressions of local identity, people identifying with their region, but at the same time, assuming they were also part of this bigger thing, this emerging French nation, even if they spoke different languages day to day.
Local feeling and national feeling growing together. And did lots of people get involved in writing these?
Yeah, participation, especially at the parish level, was incredibly high. It shows people were really engaged, felt like their voices mattered now. A real moment of grassroots political awakening.
So all these pressures, inequality, frustration, new ideas, failed reforms, it all comes to a head in 1789. Louis convenes the Estates General at Versailles. What happens when they actually get there?
Well, Louis was hesitant, didn't have a clear plan, and the Third Estate deputies, they weren't going to wait around. They realized the old structure would just sideline them.
So they took matters into their own hands.
Exactly. They did something truly revolutionary. They declared themselves the National Assembly, basically saying, we represent the nation, not these old medieval orders.
Huge move, a direct challenge, and it gained support.
It did. Critically, some liberal nobles, even the king's cousin, the Duc d'Orléans, came over and joined them. That was a massive blow to the old system's legitimacy.
Okay, so the king seems to accept this new National Assembly, but then he sacks Necker, his finance minister, who is actually quite popular. Why?
Yeah, that was a major miscalculation. Necker was seen as being on the side of reform. Sacking him just stoked fear and anger in Paris. People thought the king was going back on his word, maybe planning to use force against the assembly.
And that leads directly to
July 14th, the storming of the Bastille.
the iconic moment.
Yeah.
A symbol of royal tyranny falls. The impact must have been immense.
Absolutely enormous, and not just in Paris. McPhee mentions tiny villages carving pictures of the Bastille on their doorframes. And this guy, Palloy, who demolished it, he actually sent stones from the Bastille to all the new departments across France, like literal pieces of the revolution.
Incredible. Spreading the revolution stone by stone. And after the Bastille, you get the National Guard forming.
Yes, a citizen militia led by Lafayette, meant to keep order but also defend the assembly. And at the same time, you see the start of the émigré.
People leaving France.
Yeah, hardcore conservatives, courtiers who saw the writing on the wall, like the king's brother Artois and the queen's friend Polignac, they started heading abroad, which in itself weakened the monarchy's position.
An exodus of the old guard. But the revolution wasn't just Paris, right? Things were happening in the countryside, too. The Great Fear.
Oh, yeah. The summer of '89 saw this wave of panic and revolt sweep rural France, the Great Fear. Rumors flew about aristocratic plots, bandits. Peasants, terrified but also angry, started attacking chateaux, burning the feudal records that listed their obligations.
Targeting the symbols of their oppression.
Exactly. Even targeting powerful institutions like the Abbey of Cluny was a radical explosion of peasant anger.
How did the revolutionaries in Paris react to that? Were they pleased?
It was mixed. Some patriot committees actually cracked down hard on peasant revolts, executions even. But the National Assembly's main response was the August decrees.
What did they do?
Fundamentally, they abolished feudalism, seigneurial rights, privileges, the whole system that had structured rural life for centuries gone. A massive revolutionary change on paper.
Wow. And that led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen.
Yes, soon after. This foundational document laying out principles like liberty, equality before the law, property rights, civic dignity, a complete shift from being subjects of a king to citizens of a nation.
Sounds like a moment of incredible optimism, fraternity even.
There was definitely that feeling. But McPhee points out there was also this underlying sense that society needed civic regeneration, a need to denounce the old abuses. And practical anxieties didn't just disappear. Food prices, bread, still a huge worry. Protests continued, like river workers invading Orléans. And then, in October '89, the Women's March on Versailles.
Driven by bread prices again.
Largely, yes. And anger at the king and queen. Thousands of Parisian women marched to Versailles and basically forced the royal family to move back to Paris.
Huge. The king now basically under the eye of the Parisian crowd.
Exactly. A prisoner in his own capital, effectively. And politically, things kept evolving. The Jacobin Club started becoming really influential around this time.
A radical club.
Started out fairly moderate, actually, but became the hub for increasingly radical ideas. Even foreign observers, like the American Gouverneur Morris, were initially quite optimistic about where things were headed.
But actually running the country, building a new system.
Right.
That's the hard part, right?
That's the challenge. The National Assembly was ambitious. They completely redrew the map of France, creating departments to replace the old provinces, aiming for uniformity, rationality.
Makes sense.
But national plans often clashed with local realities. Electing local officials was new, but it also created tensions between Paris and the provinces. And then they got into debates about who was actually a citizen.
Not everyone got to vote.
No. They made this distinction between active citizens, mostly men with property who could vote, and passive citizens who couldn't. Radicals like Camille Desmoulins were already criticizing this, saying it didn't live up to the promise of equality.
So the ideals weren't always matched by the reality in those early stages.
Not fully, and unrest continued in the countryside. Protests against lingering dues, these spontaneous gatherings called wild federations in the Southwest. People wanted more change faster.
But there were also moments of unity.
Yeah.
Like the Festival of Federation.
Yeah. July 1790, meant to be this huge celebration of national unity on the anniversary of the Bastille. Very grand, lots of oaths, even international delegations. McPhee mentions Baron de Clootz bringing foreigners to celebrate. Very cosmopolitan ideal.
Sounds impressive.
It was. Noble titles were officially abolished, too. But underneath, problems festered. They abolished workers' guilds, the compagnonnages, at the same time as seigneurial dues, which angered artisans. People resisted the compromise laws on feudal dues. The whole issue of what to do with common lands was divisive. And importantly, counter-revolutionary plots were already starting to surface, like the Marquis de Favre's conspiracy.
So even in 89-90, with all the initial excitement, the fault lines were already there.
Definitely. And the émigrés, the nobles and clergy who'd fled, they were watching all this, becoming increasingly critical, organizing opposition from abroad. They even criticized nobles who stayed in France. The battle lines were being drawn.
Okay, and then comes a really major turning point, something that apparently split France right down the middle. The civil constitution of the clergy. What was that about?
Passed in 1790, it was an attempt by the Assembly to completely reorganize the Catholic Church in France, make it subordinate to the state. Clergy were to be elected, paid by the state, and crucially, had to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation, the law, the king.
Sounds controversial.
Hugely. For many devout Catholics and many priests, this was seen as the government interfering massively in spiritual matters, a violation of faith. It created a massive schism.
So priests had to choose. Side with the revolution or side with essentially the Pope?
Pretty much. It split the clergy right down the middle. Those who took the oath were juring or constitutional priests. Those who refused were non-juring or refractory.
And this division affected ordinary people too.
Oh, absolutely. Communities were torn apart. Acceptance of the oath varied massively. Very strong opposition in traditionally Catholic areas like the West, Brittany. People refused to attend services by intruder priests who'd taken the oath. It fueled resentment, mistrust, violence even. And it definitely fed into counter-revolutionary movements like those gatherings at Giles in the South.
Another layer of conflict, this time deeply religious. And then the king himself makes a dramatic move. The flight to Varennes in June 1791. Why did he run?
Louis was feeling increasingly trapped, powerless. The civil constitution of the clergy really upset him personally. So he and the family tried to escape Paris in disguise.
Where are they going?
Probably hoping to reach troops loyal to him near the border, maybe get foreign help. He left behind a document basically repudiating the whole revolution.
That they didn't make it.
No. They were recognized near the border, in Varennes, stopped, and brought back to Paris. McPhee calls it a slow and humiliating return.
Must have been devastating for the monarchy's image.
Totally. Seeing the king brought back like a prisoner, it shattered any remaining trust for many people. It made it clear he didn't accept the revolution, that he wanted to turn back the clock to his old powers. Reconciliation looked pretty much impossible after that. There was even violence on the way back. A nobleman who greeted the king was killed.
So his escape attempt basically blew up in his face and proved he couldn't be trusted. The assembly tried to smooth it over,
Right.
pretend he'd been kidnapped.
Yeah, they tried to manage the situation, declared an amnesty, basically said the revolution is over with the new constitution. But the damage was done. And new, more radical political groups were gaining ground.
Like within the Jacobins.
Exactly. Divisions deepened. People like Brissot, Robespierre, starting to push in different directions. The Constitution of 1791 created a constitutional monarchy, but it came into effect amid all this distrust, plus the threat from other European powers worried about Louis.
And some factions actually wanted war. The Girondins.
Yes, the Girondins, sort of a moderate faction within the Jacobins at that point, started pushing hard for war against Austria and Prussia. They thought it would unite the country, expose traitors, maybe even spread the revolution abroad. Kind of idealistic, maybe naive.
But Robespierre disagreed.
Strongly. He warned against it, said France wasn't ready, that war could easily backfire and destroy the revolution from within. Turned out he was right.
And internally, things were still tense. Violence continued.
Oh, yeah. Non-juring priests, former nobles, they were increasingly targeted as enemies. The new legislative assembly passed harsh laws against refractory priests, but the king kept vetoing them, which just increased the friction between him and the government.
So when war finally breaks out in April 1792, it just pours fuel on the fire.
Absolutely. Every military defeat, every rumor just intensified suspicion. Accusations of treason flew everywhere. The royal family, especially Marie Antoinette, the Austrian woman, became targets of incredibly vicious propaganda, vile cartoons, pamphlets, accusing them of plotting with the enemy.
Intense stuff.
And calls grew louder and louder to just get rid of the monarchy altogether. This leads to the insurrection of August 10th, 1792.
What happened then?
Radical sans-culottes from the Paris sections, backed by revolutionary soldiers, stormed the Tuileries Palace where the king lived. Huge battle, lots of people killed. The monarchy was effectively overthrown, suspended.
A second revolution, really, more radical. And this was followed by something truly horrific, the September massacres.
Yeah, just weeks later. In a climate of intense fear, Paris threatened by invading armies. Rumors of counter-revolutionary prisoners plotting escape mobs stormed the prisons. They dragged out prisoners, nobles, priests, common criminals, anyone suspected of opposing the revolution, and massacred them. Thousands killed in just a few days. Brutal, terrifying.
A real descent into darkness. But alongside this violence, there was also this cultural shift happening.
Definitely. A conscious effort to create a revolutionary culture. People started wearing the red Phrygian cap, the symbol of liberty. New songs took off, like the Marseillaise, trying to remake French identity.
And politically, the move towards a republic was now unstoppable, with more radical Jacobins taking charge.
Yes. Figures like Robespierre, Danton, Desmoulins, Marat, their influence surged. They pushed for a full republic. This put them on a collision course with the more moderate Girondins. And the ultimate expression of this radical shift was the trial and execution of Louis XVI.
January 1793, killing the king. That must have sent shockwaves everywhere.
Absolutely. Across Europe, it was seen as horrifying. Within France, it was deeply divisive. The vote in the new National Convention to execute him was actually quite close. The Jacobins pushed it through, defeating Girondin attempts to find alternatives, like exile or a referendum.
Why did they insist on execution?
For the hardline Jacobins, it was necessary. Louis was a traitor. He'd conspired against the nation. His execution was seen as essential for the Republic's survival. But predictably, it just inflamed opposition even more, especially in places like the Vendée.
Oh, the Vendée Rebellion. What kicked that off?
It was a perfect storm, really, starting in spring '93. Deep anger about the civil constitution of the clergy, the whole attack on traditional religion. That was huge. Plus resentment over conscription, the government demanding peasants go fight in its wars. For people in the Vendée who felt disconnected from Paris anyway, this was the last straw. And other regions resisted too, just maybe not on the same scale.
So executing the king didn't unify the nation at all. It deepened the divisions and helped usher in the Reign of Terror.
Exactly. The Republic was proclaimed. They even had brief successes like establishing a sister republic in Mainz, Germany. But internally, things were dire.
How so?
The economy was collapsing. The assignat, the revolutionary money, was becoming worthless. Wage earners were suffering badly. Support for the Republic was patchy across the country.
And then the Federalist Revolt started. What were they about?
These were major uprisings in big provincial cities, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, others, basically pushing back against Paris's dominance and the radical Jacobin control, a mix of local pride, economic interests, and fear of the radicals in the capital.
How did Paris respond?
Ruthlessly. The revolts were crushed with extreme brutality, mass executions, especially in Lyon. It created this pervasive climate of fear and suspicion. Anyone could be denounced as a counter-revolutionary. Conspiracy theories were everywhere. Families were torn apart over politics.
You mentioned figures like Jacques Roux, this ex-priest, people embracing extreme views.
Yeah, the pressure cooker environment pushed people to extremes. Roux became a leader of the Enrages, the really radical group demanding economic controls. Others, like Benoît Lecomte, became fervent local activists. Meanwhile, the actual revolutionary armies fighting foreign enemies were often in terrible shape, lacking supplies, morale low.
So it's in this context of crisis, internal revolt, foreign war, economic chaos, that they decide to implement the terror.
Yes. It was justified, officially, as an emergency measure, a way to defend the Republic against all its enemies, internal and external, to impose unity through fear and force.
And this is when the de-Christianization campaign really ramps up.
Yes, radicals pushed hard to basically erase Catholicism. Churches closed, religious statues smashed. They even destroyed the holy ampulla at Reims, the sacred oil used to anoint kings for centuries, trying to replace religion with secular cults.
Must have alienated huge numbers of people.
Massively, especially in the countryside. It just fueled the counter-revolution more. Figures like Hébert and the Enrages were really driving this, often putting pressure on the main Jacobin leadership, like Robespierre.
So tensions even within the revolutionary government itself.
Oh, definitely. Between the radical street-level sans-culottes and the more middle-class Jacobin leaders. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre, tightened its grip, declaring the government revolutionary until the peace, basically suspending normal laws. They tried to mobilize everything for the war, seizing church bells for cannons, controlling prices, and they constantly used the idea of a foreign plot to justify cracking down on opponents. Food shortages in the cities were chronic, making everything worse.
It sounds like a society under immense strain. But the terror wasn't just about repression, was it? There were cultural changes, too.
Yeah, they tried to remake society, encouraging people to use the informal tu instead of the formal vous to promote equality. New revolutionary vocabulary. The Jacobins pushed this very austere, moralistic idea of Republican virtue. Art, theater, all used for propaganda. People gave their kids revolutionary names. But there was also this tension, popular mobs smashing old symbols versus the leaders worrying about vandalism and destroying national heritage.
By late 1793, the Republic actually started having some military wins, didn't it?
They did. They pushed back the foreign invaders, recaptured Toulon from the British. That's where Napoleon first made a name for himself.
Right.
But the internal purges just kept going. The Girondins were executed. Anyone seen as opposing the Committee of Public Safety was at risk. Ironically, in February '94, they abolished slavery in the colonies, a truly radical move driven by revolutionary ideals, though with complicated results. But then the revolution started eating its own.
How?
Power struggles within the committee. Robespierre turned on the extreme radicals, the Hébertistes, and had them executed. Then he turned on the more moderate faction, Danton and his followers, and had them executed too, consolidating his own power.
It must have been terrifying and confusing for ordinary people.
Absolutely. Fear of the guillotine was pervasive, plus just weariness with the constant turmoil. The economic controls weren't really working. Robespierre tried introducing this new state religion, the cult of the supreme being, but most people were indifferent or suspicious. Yet the war machine kept grinding on. They won a major victory at Fleurus in June '94, but just before that, they passed the law of 22 Prairial.
What did that do?
It basically sped up the terror, stripped away legal protections for the accused. Executions surged in Paris. It was the high point or low point of the terror. They even organized these public banquets to try and boost morale, but the fear was palpable. And Robespierre himself seemed increasingly isolated in the final weeks.
And then suddenly it ends. The Thermidorian reaction. What happened on 9 Thermidor?
July 27, 1794. Basically a coalition of opponents within the convention, people who feared they were next on Robespierre's list, moved against him. They shouted him down, ordered his arrest. He and his key allies were executed the next day.
Just like that. And he became the scapegoat for everything.
Pretty much instantly. He was blamed for all the excesses of the terror. There was this huge wave of relief. Prisons were opened, suspects released. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed.
And then came the backlash.
Oh, yes. A period of settling scores. People involved in the terror were now hunted down. Carrier, infamous for the mass drownings in Nantes, was put on trial and executed. Power swung back to more moderate, wealthier elements. Jacobin clubs were shut down. Popular society suppressed. A definite move away from radical democracy. Even culturally, there was a reaction against the austerity of the terror years.
So a swing back towards normality, maybe. But did they undo all the revolutionary changes?
Not all of them. They tried educational reforms, and crucially, the metric system and the decimal franc, introduced around this time, stuck. Lasting legacies of that drive for rationality.
But the radical phase was definitely over.
Yes. The last attempts by the Parisian sans-culottes to assert power, the uprisings of Germinal and Prairial in '95, were crushed. Remaining radical leaders were deported. There were reprisals in the provinces too, the White Terror. But the economic situation was still terrible. Food shortages, inflation, and the war ground on.
Which leads to another new government, the Directory. What was that like?
Set up in 1795 by a new constitution. It was designed to be stable, conservative, restricted voting rights, power shared between 2 legislative councils, and a 5-man executive directory. The whole idea was to prevent a return to either Jacobin radicalism or monarchy.
Did it work? Was it stable?
Not really. Public enthusiasm was low. Religious tensions continued. Royalists kept trying to make a comeback, which led to crackdowns. Jacobin remnants were also suppressed. It was constantly lurching between threats from the left and the right.
And this is where Napoleon really starts to shine.
Exactly. He gained fame leading armies, especially in Italy, winning victories, but also by using the army to put down royalist uprisings in Paris. The Directory became increasingly reliant on the military.
Despite the political instability and economic problems.
Yeah, the economy was still a mess. The assignat finally collapsed completely. Conscription was deeply unpopular. But the armies kept fighting abroad. The Directory pursued this policy of creating sister republics in places like Italy and Holland, expanding French influence. They signed the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, a major diplomatic win.
But this expansion wasn't always welcomed?
No, often met with resistance, sometimes fueled by religion in occupied territories. The French army itself was shrinking, plagued by desertion despite the new annual conscription law, so the Directory limped along looking increasingly fragile. Napoleon returned from Italy a hero, but the government was unstable, facing plots from both Jacobins and Royalists.
Setting the stage for
the coup d'etat. 18 Brumaire, November 9th, 1799. Napoleon, backed by some politicians and the army, overthrew the Directory. End of the parliamentary phase of the revolution. Start of Napoleon's rule.
Wow. So 10 years of revolution, upheaval, terror, and it ends with a military dictatorship.
Looking back at that whole decade, what's the lasting significance? What did it all mean?
Well, the motivations were complex, weren't they? Desire for justice, national glory, stability, but the impact. undeniable and profound. Ideas like popular sovereignty, citizenship, even if imperfectly applied, they entered the bloodstream of political thought.
And concrete changes.
Oh, yes. Feudalism gone for good, new relationships to property, legal reforms, inheritance, divorce. Even when Napoleon made peace with the church through the Concordat, it was on new terms. The émigrés came back, but to a changed France. The monarchy was eventually restored, but it could never be the same monarchy.
What about politically? Did more people get a say? Compared to Britain then, yes, suffrage was wider in France, despite the limitations. Though participation in elections wasn't always high. But the abolition of seigneurialism, that was a fundamental shift in rural life. And militarily, the idea of the nation in arms changed warfare.
And the drive for uniformity.
Reshaped institutions, departments, the metric system based on rationality. But the legacy is complex. Slavery abolished, then partly reestablished by Napoleon, but Haiti born free. Huge economic disruption from the wars, shifts in rural-urban power, land redistribution.
And the terror, how's that remembered?
Still fiercely debated. Was it a necessary evil, a tragic aberration? It depends who you ask. The revolution created deep divisions that lasted for generations, people who embraced the republic versus those loyal to the old ways. And its influence spread everywhere, inspiring revolutions, but also serving as a warning.
A truly world-changing event then. Complex, contradictory, transformative.
Absolutely. It overturned privilege, wrestled violently with creating a new order, and left a legacy that France and the world are still grappling with today. Its impact, good and bad, is just immense.
So after this amazing deep dive, it's clear there are no simple takeaways from the French Revolution. It was just this colossal moment full of contradictions. But thinking about all those changes, the radicalism, the violence, the ideals, what single aspect do you think had the most far-reaching, maybe even unexpected consequence for the world we live in now? Something to ponder, maybe.
Definitely something to think about. And we really encourage listeners to check out McPhee's book, Explore More. It's such a rich, fascinating, and endlessly relevant period of history.